Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we'll hear about a joint venture to put reservist aircrew in I-Star aircraft.
To sort of try and push boundaries, challenge perhaps accepted norms, see where there are areas we can take risk. To see to the chief saying, which is, support the front line or deliver on the front line to fly, fight and win. It's exploiting that civilian experience that will give us resilience and potential agility in the future.
Also, in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you missed them, and we'll be finding out who is under the hat this week.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
Operation Pit-In. I was taken back by the ability to be able to help the refugees come through from Kabul back to the UK to a safer space.
Find out who is under the hat at the end of this episode. Now, can you take a civilian airline pilot, make them a reservist, and have them operate a state-of-the-art military I-Star aircraft? Well, if the aircraft has essentially the same flight deck, why not? I met with Group Captain I-Star Reserves, who aims to do this at scale with X-Flight. Welcome to Inside Air. You join us today in a very special location. We're in High Wycombe, but not just High Wycombe, which is the Air Command and headquarters of the Royal Air Force. We're actually in Lancaster Block on the ground floor, and we're in Bomber Harris's office. And I am joined by Dave Brown, who's going to tell you a little bit about himself in a moment, and Group Captain Ryan Mannering.
So Ryan Mannering, I'm normally known as Manners. I spent 20 years in the Royal Air Force as a regular, as a pilot, and then at the end of 2017 I left to join a UK commercial airline flying Boeing 737s. My current role is Group Captain I-Star Reserves, supporting a joint venture between COS Reserves, Air Vice Marshal Munro, and the I-Star Force Commander, Air Commodore Strazdin. And previously to that, I've been supporting E7 Wedgetail Introduction to Service using my civilian 737 qualifications.
I'm just going to chuck in a little extra question that you weren't expecting.
Go on.
So also down this corridor with Bomber Harris's office, we're surrounded by the air safety world. And there's a magazine called Air Clues. And in that magazine, I learnt about flying from this. Do you have a moment in your career where you learnt about flying from a particular incident? Now, this is the time to confess and to spill the beans on that moment.
Well, noting that some of my bosses are still, or former bosses are still in the Royal Air Force, I'm going to cut a swathe of those I've learnt from flying out of it straight away. But one thing that does come back to me was on the Tornado GL1 operational conversion unit, was my crew solo day. So first time you pair up with a student navigator and myself, a chap called Toby Warren, who's still serving. And Toby and I launched off thinking we were utter heroes, only to have a seagull go down one of the engines and shut it down.
Ooh.
And I remember that we were only supposed to use reheat, so the afterburner, judiciously over land for flight safety. Anyway, I used the reheat because we were getting slow and obviously only on one engine. Landed the aeroplane, which was great. I thought that we were heroes, going to get a green endorsement in Air Clues, only to be summoned to the boss's office for a telling off for using reheat over land. So not necessarily I'd learnt about flying, but learnt about exposure.
You learned about management.
Yes.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And now you fly the 737.
Correct, yes, right, yeah.
Yeah, okay, super. Well, Dave, tell us your job and can you describe where we are sat today recording this episode?
Certainly. I'm the GD Coord, which is General Duties Coordinator. I've run all the awards that are done at Air Command and RAF High Wycombe. But where we're sat at the moment, you're sat in the office of the former Chief of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris, to which I'm the historian and curator of this office.
which is why we've got you here for two reasons. One, we couldn't get in here without you watching us. And the second thing is you're going to give us historical reality checks as we chat. And so I saw your face as we walked through the front door of this office. Why is this place important to you?
Well, it's just I walked in and I was in awe, having read about Bomber Harris and wanting to be a bomber pilot from when I joined the Royal Air Force, and lucky enough to fly Tornado GR1s and GR4s. So I looked to the Bomber Command history with awe and reverence, really. So yeah, it's a real privilege to be sat in this office recording this podcast.
Thank you very much. Welcome both to Inside Air. The reason why we're talking today, Group Captain Manners, is the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, the reserves, potentially regaining the capacity to have aircrew flying frontline aircraft. Is that right?
Yeah, so that part of the reason we're discussing this is to all continue the ongoing work that Royal Auxiliary part-time volunteer reserve aircrew are exploited within the Royal Air Force. So there's work ongoing at the moment within from 622 Squadron actually down at RAF Brize-Norton, integrating, and to a limited extent in other areas, including the ISTAR force where I work. ISTAR being intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance. And in my previous PTVR role supporting Wedgetail, which is a Boeing 737 derivative coming into service, it was how can we expand the role of aircrew within the reserves, and more broadly looking pan-profession and pan-rank to see how we can better exploit reservists throughout, using the ISTAR force as a pilot project, as a vehicle.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, if we again wind the clock back, it's handy you being here, Dave, is looking at the history of the Royal Air Force. Maybe, Dave, you're the person to tell us about the use of auxiliaries and volunteer reserves as aircrew pre-World War II and maybe into post-World War II.
In the Second World War, they were used. Like one of the most, they reckon the best pilot on 617 Squadron on the Dams raid was John Hopgood, and he was a VR.
So he was a volunteer reservist. But it also happened post-war as well. We know that post-World War II that there were some auxiliary units where we still had aircrew. But then they disappeared. Any idea why that was?
I think in the interwar periods from the end of the Second World War going forwards, there was a lack of resource for the Auxiliary Air Force, as was then became the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, that were given a squadron. So they had their own squadron, their own engineers, their own aircraft, and that was just unsustainable going forward. So then the use of reservist squadrons, or the existence of those squadrons, gradually diminished as resource became more taut as we worked through the century, unfortunately.
And what about aircraft type? I presume that had something to do with it as well.
Well, there was a lot of similarity, because back in the early Auxiliary Air Force days, there was almost a stipend or money for individuals joining the Auxiliary Air Force to be paid to learn to fly or present with civilian credentials that could be accredited for military flying. And obviously, as time progresses, the complexity of the airplanes increases, the roles increasing, whether it's a transport airplane or a airplane that delivers weapons, then there's a greater training burden. So that was obviously going to put additional strain on. So for reasons that are probably unknown to me, and I'd look to the right-hand side to the historian to say why, but that role gradually diminished throughout the century, sadly.
I think the training period was too long to put them on. So complex, the new aircraft.
Maybe we'll touch on that today. For multi-engine aircraft, how long roughly is it from someone walking through the gates at Cranwell, the RAF college, through to flying their first operational sortie in years, roughly?
So I'm no subject matter expert in the training pipeline, but I can only refer back to when I went through training, which was some years ago now, but you're looking between 3 to 4 years, depending on availability of courses and timelines and things like that. But traditionally, from walking into RAF College Cranwell to being on your first frontline operational type, aspirationally used to be about 3 years. What it is right now, I couldn't precisely tell you, I'm afraid.
So, maybe it's 3 years if there's no hold-ups, but there's got to be availability of places on courses, availability of aircraft and trainers.
Absolutely.
So if an individual decided to leave the Air Force today and go and do something else with their lives, it would potentially take anywhere 3 to 5 years to replace that person in the cockpit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that there is a lead time for that training.
And was that a motivation for you? Because you're the driving force behind a new initiative or an exploration into delivering this.
So yeah, in my previous PTVR role, my reservist role, I was supporting Wedgetail using my civilian qualifications. So having had a career in the military as a pilot and left and joined a commercial airline, and having used all the processes within the RAF to get to that point, I was exploiting my civilian subject matter expertise flying Boeing 737s to support entry into service of Wedgetail. And going through that, and this comes back to what we're saying, where history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it rhymes. I've been using my civilian qualifications to help bringing Wedgetail into service, and mobilised earlier this year actually to train the Wedgetail test pilot and one of the qualified flying instructors, one of the QFIs, using my civilian qualifications. So this is where the rhyming with history comes in. And the motivation for the joint venture that we're calling it between COS Reserves, Air Vice Marshal Munro, and the I-Star Force Commander, Air Commodore Strasdin, was can we have a look at or have a pilot project to see how we can better exploit the use of reservists within the I-Star Force, purely as a pilot project and purely to almost enhance or better exploit the ongoing excellent reservist activity that happens pan the Air Force. But it was using this as a pilot project and my subject matter expertise in a certain area, which is the I-Star Force, to sort of try and push boundaries, challenge perhaps accepted norms, see where there are areas we can take risk, to see to the chief's aim, which is, support the front line or deliver on the front line to fly, fight and win. And that's where the genesis of it came from.
It's interesting you say that, because it appears that as a reservist, as a civilian airline pilot on 737s, but as a reservist, you were the most qualified and experienced person in the Royal Air Force, despite being a reservist, to do that job, to teach those individuals. Is that...
I wouldn't go as far to say I was the most qualified. I was suitably qualified and experienced.
Oh, the SQEP thing.
The SQEP thing, exactly that. So I was suitably qualified and experienced. There are 737 derivatives in the Royal Air Force at the moment, the primary one being Poseidon P8 in its maritime role. And that is busy generating its own force. So potentially there are instructors there to deliver this training. However, their task focus elsewhere, delivering on the front line. So this was a really good use of a reservist in order to train, firstly, the test pilot, because that individual is needed. And interestingly, for their pre-course qualifications for doing testing, they needed a commercial type rating. So I was in a lovely position where I could support that. And due to other factors within the program, one of the qualified flying instructors needed training, so we crewed them together as a two-seat aeroplane and brought it forward. So, and this is where the genesis of the joint venture came. It was with Wedgetail, wouldn't it be nice to have X-Flight? I thought of having E or F. X sounded better for extra, and it just had something more marvelly about it. Yeah, exactly, something more marvelly about it. And it was wouldn't it be lovely to have a PTVR flight for Wedgetail, which consisted of an entire crew that day-to-day integrated seamlessly as 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, doesn't matter, with the squadron. But should we reach a point whereby there is a strategic narrative that dictates we mobilise that whole crew, we've suddenly generated resilience. There's an extra crew that can provide to the RAF frontline to fight, flight and win, to use the chief's words. And that kind of grew, and then said, well, if we're going X flight, why don't we have X squadron? Why don't we have a PTVR squadron and use 737 experience that's out in the UK, not only within the Royal Air Force, but also outside, because there are a number of UK-based airlines that fly Boeing 737s. So why don't we exploit that? And like I say, going back to the history rhyming, it's exploiting that civilian experience that will give us resilience and potential agility in the future. So the whole joint venture grew up around X-Flight, X-Squadron, and then grew legs as it looked like we could do things more efficiently with reserves within the I-Star Force, exploiting ongoing great work that's there, but make it pan-profession and pan-rank.
We've talked about aircrew on X Squadron. Will this bleed over to the engineering support for the aircraft?
So aspirationally, in my head, it starts with building a flight. And this can be both P8, so Poseidon, and E7 Wedgetail as well. So we need to go on sort of 3 lines of activity. And the way I framed the joint venture initial starting gate is if there are people who are qualified, let's put a round peg in a round hole. If they, pound profession and pound rank this is, if they're out there and available as a reservist and we can fill a gap, whether that's Trade Group 1, whether it's a navigator on RJ, whether it's a pilot on Poseidon, then we'll put them in that hole. If they're not, if people are leaving the service, and we know that people are leaving the service, then we're looking to harvest them. So make them aware. And having this podcast is a lovely example of, again, promoting awareness of things that are going on. There are endeavours, like I say, there is ongoing reservist activity throughout the Royal Air Force. This is just an isolated pocket where we're trialling other things within the iStar Force. But if we can make people aware, or perhaps entice them into the RORCSAF to fulfil a role supporting or delivering on the front line, then great. And then aspirationally, there is a grow line where perhaps we can have people joining the RORCSAF at post-school, post-university, commissioning straight in, and just creating a demand signal so that we can enable the RAF to grow its RORCSAF should that demand signal come.
So if there is a 737 pilot civilian listening to this today, should they be thinking, and this could be an additional side career for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole point of this, and going back to your previous question, which I note I didn't answer, is yes, pound profession. So if there is a 737 licensed engineer who perhaps is a pure civilian and never had a military career and wanted to explore opportunities to work as an engineer in a military context on perhaps P8 or Wedgetail, the door is open to explore everything. I'm very much in the mindset of we'll try it. If we fail, we'll fail quickly, turn around, have another go, and try and make it better. And that's the same with the aircrew. So to answer your most recent question, yes, if there is a civilian pilot out there, and note, and it does come with a caveat that they have to meet the entry requirements, which are medical. But again, we're looking to streamline the process for entry into the RORCSAF as what we're calling a lateral entrant, which has been done before. This is not virgin ground. It has been done before. It's just not particularly common. If we can make it more the norm, then perhaps there are opportunities then for people to work as a civilian airline pilot. And if some airlines have periods that are slightly more fallow in flying, they can jump into the RAF, or they can mix and match their work. And equally, perhaps there are times when they want a break from their civilian career and can mobilise for a period of time or for an exercise or an operation. Again, not unlike what our coalition partners and colleagues do. The Americans do this and have done it for a very long time. So there are definitely lessons we can take from across the pond as well.
Okay. Let's have a look at the relationship that the Royal Air Force might foster with civilian airlines or companies that operate the aircraft, 737 for instance. What's in your mind for collaboration and working together? You know, is it a two-way path?
Yeah, this has absolutely got to be a bilateral engagement, and both parties need to be on board with quid pro quos on either side. I stress very much that this will require me to work with reserves employees engagement more broadly as well. This is very much these are the bare bones of an idea. But in my mind's eye, if there's a partner airline that flies 737s and there's a Royal Air Force, there's almost two parallel tracks that run where we share our resources at the start. So if an airline has an academy for training somebody, let's take the risk and put an RAF individual in through their training system, and we take a civilian and put them through our military training system. And then they can have zigzag careers at that point where they can fly either type. Noting there'll be technical differences in the airplanes, subtly so, one will have a different role to purely doing an airline job. But then it affords us a certain amount of agility, and it ties in with the RAF sort of pivot towards agile combat employment. Perhaps we could share training resource. I mean, if you have all your training resources in one single building, it's a centre of gravity. So what if something happens to that? But if we're in an agreement, some kind of bilateral relationship with an airline, if we could share training resources, that affords us some ability and some flexibility to be dynamic should worst case scenarios happen. And then if we get this right at the beginning, it's a foundation stone for through career that these individuals will have a flying career civilian, they'll have a flying career military, but also they become staff officers. So then they can provide support. And then as that grows, with hopefully a demand signal from our grow line, that actually we increase the RORCSAF, their presence becomes more prolific, and we're able to support and or deliver on the front line.
What sort of feedback are you getting from airlines at the moment?
I've not engaged directly with an airline yet, purely because this joint venture kicked off only a couple of weeks ago. I'm recruiting the team that are going to work with me to take this forward, and I'm very conscious that I need to engage with reserves employer engagement. Otherwise it's manners on a good idea club going off to an airline which is definitely not following the correct protocols, but over the coming months hopefully recruit a Boeing 737 qualified lateral pilot to join this joint venture and hopefully find a pathway to flying military 737 derivatives, whether that be Wedgetail or Poseidon.
Okay, and from a location perspective, whereabouts are these aircraft operating from?
So Poseidon's currently based at RAF Lossiemouth. Wedgetail will be there too, although it's still in the process of standing up. The program's still in its developmental stages at the moment.
Right, okay. So the whole concept that you have here, whilst it's reignited, let's say, for the concept for aircrew, it's not new to the reserves, is it? If you think about the medical reserves, logistics, police, can you tell me a little bit about that side of reserves? Obviously, it's not your profession, but you have an understanding.
Yeah, so obviously not my swim lane, but there are certain professions that integrate seamlessly, and just having come into the media office, you couldn't tell the difference between a reservist and a regular. And reservists have very different terms and conditions of service, whether it's part-time volunteer reserve, full-time reserve service, volunteer ex-regular reserve. The endeavour I'm trying to run it down is on part-time volunteer reserve terms for various reasons. But my understanding is with these other professions, medical, like you say, logistics and others, they integrate seamlessly and it works. And that's because there's a certain element of mass there as well. So there is resilience in that mass. We need to get to that stage for other professions as well. And we need to make it the norm. That's been normalised in those other professions. And I think we can almost go back to what Granby in 91, where I think logistics and medical seamlessly mobilised, as did the RAF Regiment, I believe, to support that war effort as well. Yeah,
I'm aware that 4626 Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron, they mobilised as a formed unit in 91 and again in 2003. I guess that is where you're looking to take this. Reserves often operate as individual augmentees, so one person going to fill a post and integrate into a larger body, but you're here with this X-Flight, X-Squadron. What does the rest of the Air Force think about this?
Well, I'm assuming we'll get some feedback from this podcast, hopefully. As long as we're true to the objectives, and that is either supporting or delivering on the front line, and again, without significant impact to the front line, whether it's training burden or taking away from guys on the front line, but with the advent of highly or simulators with high fidelity, we should be in a position where we are delivering with reservists on the front line. Now, this is a project that has a 10, 15, 20-year event horizon. It's going to be ones and twos initially that will hopefully grow. So aspirationally, when we look at X Squadron, which will hopefully get a number plate at some point, if this is successful, then there will be a cohort of PTVR individuals that day-to-day support squadrons, mobilise as they need to, whether it's for an exercise, an operational deployment, and in the event of a time of crisis, can strategically mobilise to stand up as a formed unit. And if we can get to a point where maybe that could be for an RPAS squadron where you have X-Flight, an X-Flight can become a thing within any squadron. That whether that's perhaps a remotely piloted air system squadron that you have X-Flight of guys leaving that we've harvested. So we're taking that experience, and instead of it going elsewhere, they come back on a part-time volunteer basis. Now there will be currency requirements and regulations that need to be adhered to. But again, these are all the things that, depending on timings and strategic context, we can take risk or we can increase the risk. So we can play tunes on all of that. But it also feeds to, well, how do we feed this into the I-Star force, for example? So obviously being localised, because it's my area of expertise and where I've worked as a reservist, it's how do we manage these auxiliaries in and out, making sure that we get that resource. We need that personnel resource because we need JPA numbers. And again, this is all part of the sort of wider work, because as soon as I lift up one rock, I realise that there's something I didn't understand about policy here or there that I need to go and learn and go, well, can we conform with that? Do I need to ask to break that policy, or do I fail, turn around and see where can I support rewriting that policy or disregarding it, and operating in a sphere where perhaps forgiveness is easier than permission, dare I say that on a recording.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to ask you because we know that the podcast is listened to at all ranks, right from first joining the Air Force through to running the Air Force. What message have you got for our senior leadership team?
There is an experiment ongoing in the iStar Force that is going to try and better exploit the ongoing reserve activity. In this instance, focused within the iStar Force, will be challenging existing procedures, policies, boundaries, with the pure aspiration of supporting or delivering on the front line. I'm expecting to fail, but we're going to fail quickly, turn around and have another go until we are achieving that objective.
Super. And as I'm listening to you, and having worked across the Air Force and been around a little while, one of the things that the complaints that I hear on squadrons is that they're always out the door. There's no time to just sit back and reset your life because your next deployment is just round the corner. Could this help with that situation?
Yes, I think it can. And obviously, I've gone out and networked, spoken to people over coffee and bought numerous coffees. And this is where ones and twos matter in the first instance, because, for example, if a squadron is hurting for Trade Group 1 supervisors, then perhaps if I get somebody in a day a week, that gives that one supervisor who's already very busy just a break. So just the ones, twos are wins. Every single individual that can support or deliver on the front line is a win. That will ease the burden of the regulars. And then as we get it right and we learn, perhaps get the terms and conditions of service better, we recruit more people in, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We deliver more on the front line, which eases the regulars, which perhaps might reduce the outflow rate, then it can only be positive. And like I say, I'm quite happy to be told that you're failing and have another go. I'm not proud about this. It's one of the things that I'll go back to. If I'm not supporting or delivering on the front line, then I'm wasting my time, because that's where the focus has got to be.
Okay. Message for your colleagues that might be flying with you in the future. What is it like being a reservist and mixing a busy day job with being wearing a uniform?
It's a good question. As an airline pilot, you don't follow a regular work pattern. So I'm beholden upon a roster that my airline gives me, and I have an eight-week outlook. I have limited periods of leave because of demand signals within the airline. And what was interesting for me was I left the RAF after 20 years service. I had been an air cadet, sponsored through, all the way through, and it's all I'd ever known. And leaving was on my terms, which was what I wanted to do. However, clearly there's a little part of me that didn't want to let it go. And I enjoy doing what I'm doing. And as a reservist, most reservists do it because they want to. So they're motivated purely by being a part of something. Whether they've been in it before or want to be a part of something bigger, that's the motivation. So reservists come into work happy and keen to work. So for me, with my airline job, when I fly, I'm busy, but when I have my down days, there's only so many jobs around the house that I can do and tidy the garden that actually I like to exercise my grey matter. I clearly get bored doing nothing, so this is why I make trouble for myself and starting joint ventures. So it does require balancing. There's no getting around it with childcare, a serving spouse who's still flying. There are challenges, but because one's motivated, because you do reservist out of choice, it includes in the title part-time volunteer reserve, then I find the time to do it, and I get enjoyment from doing it. And if I can support the front line, great, because it helps the regulars who are on the front line doing their job, which is what reservists should be doing.
Great. Sounds like it scratches the itch.
It does, very much so.
Okay. Now, I'm going to come back to you, Dave. How do you think history will view this enterprise?
I think it'd be very good. But listening to Manners, what he was saying, I feel that to integrate the civilian side of flying with the military, I think it's a brilliant thing, especially when you've got the same airframe. The only thing I did feel was, how do they feel about joining or becoming reservists flying? If you've got a problem somewhere and I've got to go into that problem, are they going to think, I don't fancy doing that, but I don't mind flying around the Atlantic Ocean?
That's a very good question.
It is a very good question. So I've sampled a few of my colleagues in the airline, And there's a number of individuals who are very keen to serve, perhaps because they couldn't get into the Air Force when they were younger, whether it was medical issues or life, it just didn't work at that time. It's not without risk. So it is not, but for those I've spoken to, again, it's a small sample size, they want to be a part of something, they want to give. And if they can't join in a flying capacity, they're really keen to join in a ground capacity and give their experience towards the service. So I don't think it's going to be an issue. People who are that motivated will come and seek it out. There'll have to be discussions and they'll need to be made aware. And when you're attested, obviously, as we all know, you get to that point where, okay, I'm now signing on the dotted line. So, but yes, nothing we're going to do here is without risk. So,
well, it was proved, wasn't it, with the Falklands War when I was still in the Air Force, the Falklands War and the 2 Gulf Wars, where people were they'd have took their right hand off to get into the military and do their bit.
There'll always be an attraction, and you'll always find people that want to fly aircraft. It's just the nature of the business.
You'll always find people to serve. I never forget being more surprised than being in Lashkar in Helmand in 2006 and chatting to a watchkeeper who was a British Airways captain, and he had mobilised for 6 months to be a watchkeeper in the 3 Commando headquarters because he was a reservist and he was proud to serve, and that was something he wanted to do.
Okay,
in the strangest of places as well.
Super. Well, look, on that point, I think we'll take a wrap. Group Captain Manners, good luck with the programme.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Dave Brown, thank you for joining us today. It's great to get a bit of history in.
Thank you.
This is Reheat. I'm AS1 Victoria Andrews. The UK has signed an international treaty with Japan and Italy for a future combat air programme that aims to develop an innovative stealth fighter with supersonic capability and equipped with cutting-edge technology. The aircraft aims to harness next-generation technologies and become one of the world's most advanced, interoperable, adaptable and connected fighter jets in service. The programme is expected to create highly skilled jobs both in the UK and in partner countries for more than a decade. The treaty marks a key stage of the landmark Global Combat Air Programme, with this combat air aircraft due to take to the skies by 2035. Logistics personnel have refuelled an Atlas A400M transport aircraft using a tactical fuel system known as an air-landed aircraft refuelling system. This supports aircraft operating in remote locations. Number 1 Expeditionary Logistics Squadron constructed a fabric tank using snow-filled sandbags to support the structure, before firstly defuelling and then refuelling the Atlas heavy lift transporter. The successful test is the first time the concept has been trialled in the extreme cold of the high north and took place as part of Exercise Arctic Phoenix. The exercise has seen personnel from across the RAF operating in the Arctic under adverse weather conditions and with limited daylight. The RAF Air Mobility Force has carried out sorties to recover exercise equipment from the Middle East, including a Royal Navy helicopter. The helicopter from 845 Naval Air Squadron is a Merlin Mark IV and was loaded onto a 99 Squadron RAF C-17 Globemaster strategic transport aircraft. The C-17 can rapidly deliver all types of cargo and troops worldwide. And this year's New Year Honours List has been published. Members of the whole force have been recognised for their contribution to RAF service. The full list of recipients can be viewed on social channels or at raf.mod.uk. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
I'm AS1 Hussey, just call me Ewan.
What's your profession?
I'm an air cartographer in the Air and Space Operations profession at RAF Northolt.
What's the best thing about your job?
Now, the best part of my career has got to be working for the Typhoon squadrons. They come to us whenever they need to go on exercise or deployments, and we provide them with that bespoke coverage.
Hardest part of your job?
Now, that's also the hardest part of my career as well, because the deadlines are usually so tight and the operational requirement is at such a high case that it can be tough to get those out at times, but we always make sure that we do.
Best location you've served?
Best place is definitely the Al Minhad Air Base in the UAE, working with New Zealand Air Force and Australian Air Force coalition forces. It was so eye-opening to being able to see how the different forces work and how we as an Air Force integrate with those.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
It's got to be an AeroPress. Like, got to have that brew on the go regardless of where you are. It definitely helped me out a lot.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
Operation Pitting. I was taken back by the ability to be able to help the refugees come through from Kabul back to the UK to a safe space.
Thanks, AS1 Hussey, for helping us to plot our way through the uncharted territory that is Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.